Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Rosen Wartell, and thank you for joining us on this, the third of our series of quick discussions with leading policymakers and urban analysts on questions emerging from the COVID-19 crisis. I'm Sarah Rosen Wartell, and I have the great honor of being president of the Urban Institute, wishing I was there, but in fact, actually in my second bedroom at home. A few housekeeping notes, if we could. This will be about 40-minute discussion. The event is being recorded and will be available afterwards online, as well as some links to some documents and things that perhaps some of our presenters will mention during the discussion. All of the participants, you are muted, and so if you have questions, we encourage you to type them in the questions box, and we will answer them if we have time. We have a lot to cover in 40 minutes, but we'll do the best we can. Please, I encourage you to join the conversation and share your thoughts and concerns as well online on Twitter using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. Second, I want to say that I hope all of you who are with us today are well, and so too are those you care for. At Urban, we've been telling our colleagues that that is their first and highest priority, is to take care of themselves in an extremely challenging time. But we are also doing, I'm so proud, a wonderful job of rallying to help bring forward evidence-based knowledge, to help make policymakers make better decisions that, especially in crisis, are equitable and inclusive and that protect vulnerable families, communities, firms, and helps the economy to rebound. So we're trying to think simultaneously in three different dimensions. How do we strengthen the response? How do we plan for and accelerate the recovery as we emerge from the isolation of the pandemic? And finally, how do we work to build a more resilient future that helps us protect individuals during future shocks, whether those shocks are health shocks or economic shocks, climate, or other technological and sectoral changes that are happening all the time, which make it so hard for people to kind of get knocked off their feet and get back again, and almost impossible to build a better future for themselves and their families. So we're working on response, recovery, and long-term resilience as well. Today, we're going to talk about the Paycheck Protection Program, which was established by the CARES Act and expanded, in fact, just last weekend. Sorry, my technology is going funny here. And I'm really pleased to be joined today by three great experts on this. First, we have, at least on my bottom left, I'm not sure, Jason Tepperman, you can wave, Jason, who brings experience as a small business investor with deep expertise in community banking. In 2010, he is currently a managing director of the PLC Fund Advisors, which is the manager of Promontory Local Credit's lending facilities. In 2010, Jason was appointed to a post at the Treasury Department to lead the $4 billion Small Business Lending Fund, which partnered with hundreds of community banks across the country to increase commercial lending during the Great Recession. Our second guest is Noel Poyo, whose 20-year professional career has focused on integrating low-income people and immigrants into the mainstream of our economy, as well as improving the livability and economic resilience of low-income communities. He currently serves as executive director of NALCAB, which is the National Association of Latino Community Asset Builders, and he's a great friend and partner of us on many occasions at Urban. Finally, my colleague Brett Theodos joins us. He is a senior fellow and director of the Community Economic Development Hub at the Urban Institute, where he looks at many issues, including capital for underserved communities and small businesses. So let me just very briefly set the scene. As the pandemic was unfolding, it became clear that millions of small businesses would struggle to keep their doors open with their customers unable to come knock on those doors, costing millions of people their jobs. The CARES Act created the Paycheck Protection Program to offer low-interest forgivable loans to small businesses and nonprofits, and it boosted funding for a program that SBA already had called the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. The Paycheck Protection Program was put in place, I think, with two basic purposes in mind: to try to help keep businesses afloat, and equally important, to keep people on their payroll. It was in many ways a partner to another element of the CARES Act, which was the expansion of the unemployment program, benefits program, which was designed in the event that you didn't get to keep your job, allow people to continue to have income during this crisis. But we're seeing that these PPP loans are not always ending up where they would make the most difference. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about the intention of the program, the mechanics of its implementation, what the PPP and other lending programs have done so far to address these needs, and particularly what they have not. What we are seeing for small business owners, in particular those in Black and Latinx and other underserved communities. And then finally, all this in 40 minutes, I hope we're going to get to what kinds of actions policymakers should be taking moving forward to create a more equitable recovery. So let me turn to you, Brett, to start us off, to try to put us back in, I think it was 4 weeks ago, but it feels like 4 years ago when the CARES Act was being developed, to describe the challenge it was trying to remedy and the sort of theory of how this program would make a difference. Thanks.
Sarah, and thanks everybody for joining today. So it is hard to go back, but this started with the health pandemic. As we know, it became very clear that a lot of businesses would be affected. Economy moved from healthy and functioning for a lot of people, though not everyone, to incredibly high unemployment claims in just a couple of weeks. And so we saw the first effects clearly in retail, lodging, food services, some of the sectors most affected, that are also some of the largest employers and industries in small businesses. Even before the crisis, the average small business had just 2 weeks of reserves. So there wasn't a lot of wiggle room to begin with. So understandably, a lot of pressure on Congress to act quickly. They did, passing multiple rounds of relief, emergency recovery funding that is the largest in modern history, significant portion of which is this program that we're going to talk about today. And as you mentioned, Sarah, the basic conception is both to try to help firms and to try to help employees. There may be some tensions there, but that was the design. And the focus and thought was work with existing delivery channels. So we've got the SBA, work with partners who can move a mountain of money very quickly. So let's work with banks. And to date, with the first and now the second tranche, Congress has put over $600 billion with a B dollars into it. So this is a big effort.
Thanks, great. So Jason, SBA had to quickly produce some guidance and essentially get this program started, because the whole idea was it was going to be an interim solution. And in fact, in those days, we still naively thought this might be for a matter of weeks or a couple of months. But in fact, they made a lot of choices about how they were going to implement the program. Can you describe the mechanics of the program that they designed and where those choices ended up being made?
Sure. So the program as designed is fairly straightforward. A business is able to obtain a low-cost loan or an amount equal to 2.5 times its monthly payroll. If they keep their employees on board, they're able to have a substantial portion of that loan forgiven. In most cases, with the inclusion of some other expenses, it'll be the full amount. Now, with respect to the way it was, the decisions that were made subsequently, Treasury and the SBA set this up so that virtually every small business in the country, and some large ones as well, could receive these loans, which are in practice grants. In general, a business will need to have less than 500 employees, but many industries like mining and agriculture already had existing carve-outs from the SBA. In addition, for larger entities. In addition, the statute included a provision where any hotel or restaurant could get a loan, no matter its size, as long as no one location had more than 500 employees. And so that was the basis on which it was reported one hotel company received over $125 million through this program. Another carve-out was that any owner of a franchise, again, no matter how many, could get a loan for each franchise, including stores that were owned by a franchisor. Again, this was the provision under which a car dealership, auto dealer, received more than $75 million, which they have since said they'll return. Foreign ownership was okay. So a US subsidiary of a wholly foreign-owned entity would qualify, and there was no distinction between public and privately held firms. I think most importantly, there wasn't a requirement that the business demonstrate that the money was actually needed to keep people employed. Where there is a check the box type certification that the current economic uncertainty makes the loan request necessary to support ongoing operations. And what business owners have found is that's a phrase that can either be highly restrictive or a somewhat meaningless tautology, depending on how it's interpreted. And the SBA had made the decision not to clarify it. But in the end, there was only about $350 billion available in the first round. And collectively, these companies have eligible payroll that exceeds well over $700 billion. And this created a rush to the gates. It was clear that this was a ship that didn't have enough lifeboats. And that's what motivated businesses to rush toward their banks to receive the funding and a number of the backlogs we've seen since. Now, one brief note on the banks, this has been quite a bit different in practice from what they had imagined up front. The banks thought that they would receive loans that paid 4% interest for 10 years and would be guaranteed by the government. Treasury and SBA decided that the pricing would instead be 1% for 2 years. And so it's far less profitable for banks than they had originally anticipated. And operationally, it's been extremely difficult for many of them. As a consequence, banks naturally look to support their best accounts first, even though these were not always the businesses that had the greatest immediate needs.
So Noel, thanks, Jason. The consequence for all of this on the ground, you're a small business owner trying to experience the system that just Jason described. What is it like? And describe some of the frustrations that have emerged from this program.
Right. So I think, if anybody's been reading the news, we've seen a fair amount of this, right? So, this does demonstrate, it is difficult to regulate in legislation. That is to say, it's hard for Congress to knock out all of the details. And this is where you see the difference in intent between Congress and Treasury and SBA. So there are a few really key things that happened in the Treasury Department in the rollout of this that create a lot of pain on the ground for what you would think of as sort of normally small businesses and what often get categorized as micro businesses, the vast majority of businesses in this country that are under 10 employees and indeed sole proprietors. So for example, with sole proprietors, the law allows 1099 contractors to be actually a part of the sort of overall quote unquote payroll of a business. And it was the Treasury Department that decided, no, these are separate businesses. And so if you have a 1099 contractor that gets all or the vast majority of their revenue from one business, they can't be included in that larger business's application. As a result, the larger business with their lawyer and their accountant and their prime banking relationship with the bank is going to get to the trough first when it was all dumped in, right? And the 1099 contractor was still asking, so where do I go? And clicking on the SBA website, right? A lot of that actually happened because the Treasury Secretary was out so early communicating ahead of banks about this. Lots of people were looking to the government, actually clicking on the SBA website and Treasury website, even to apply, right? Because the application was first put out by Treasury. So that confusion quickly turned to anger when folks were unable to access it. And it brings up the second really major issue here, which is the channels by which the dollars are flowing, right? There was a choice to use banks, but of course the Treasury Department certifies community development financial institutions, and the FDIC identifies minority depository institutions as institutions that specialize in getting dollars to that small business, that apple pie and mom, a small business that we all sort of oftentimes have in our head, that in fact were not getting access to the dollars. And those institutions were actually largely cut out, both because of regulatory reasons why many CDFIs couldn't even be a lender under the program, but then secondarily simply because a very large bank is going to get to the trough faster with stronger IT systems, more people doing it, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it's been a little rough on the ground, I think, for the average business owner.
Front page of the New York Times would suggest little rough is an understatement. So those, obviously there are lots of different small businesses, ones that employ 400 people and those that employ 3 or 4 family members, all of which are, I think, were initially imagined to be part of this program. But as you mentioned, the dollars went fast, and they went fast predominantly to particular, to some of the larger firms. And so quickly there was pressure on Congress to add additional resources, and just last weekend, Congress added an additional $320 billion for the program. So Noel, I'm going to start with you, and we'll sort of go in reverse order this time. So talk to me about whether or not you think that additional resources is problem solved, or do we still have access issues, and give me a little sense of what those are.
Yeah, in short, nothing was solved. It's interesting that the sort of media narrative and reality of members of Congress getting phone calls from irate business owners was so powerful that there was, in the negotiations for the second tranche of this money, a very early agreement to do a set aside intended for the little guy. But as these things go sometimes, right, what we ended up with was a $60 billion set aside in another $310 billion overall tranche of money. So most of the money is going to flow, exactly like the last round did. Then the $60 billion set aside, as you dig into the details of that, you begin to see how there was essentially, I think, an attempt to push back on the narrative with no true change to the mechanism. So of that 60 billion, half, 30 billion, is set aside for banks with asset sizes of 10 to 50 billion. And essentially that is the, a few hundred large banks, but not the really, really large banks. And so they got to set aside for their customers. You can decide for yourself whether you think that solves the problem of the little guy getting money. And then the other 30 billion, which was much more explicitly aimed at quote unquote the little guy, the eligible lenders there, after a good deal of fighting, included community development financial institutions, minority depository institutions. We're doing pretty well so far. And then banks and credit unions with asset sizes under 10 billion, which on the banking side is more than 97% of banks in the country. Now, that's not 97% of deposits in the country, but if you're talking again about a rush to the trough, right, which clicked off on Monday morning and is likely to be done by Thursday, probably at the latest, and with a bunch of CDFIs not even approved in the system, you can be clear again, who is going to get to that money first? And of course, the other dynamic here is that the line of approved or ready applications had been developed, that pipeline had been developed between round 1 and 2, right? And so do we expect there to be any difference really between the deployment? Very little. You may have the average loan size go down a little bit, but even if it were cut in half, we're still talking about an average loan size well over $100,000, which again, if you start doing some calculations on what a 10-person shop with close to minimum wage employees, what they would actually get out of it, I think we shouldn't expect there to be much difference at all in the second round as opposed to the first.
So Noel just did a good job describing the institutions who are going to be making these loans. Brett, you've begun to do some analysis to look at the firms that end up getting the benefit of these loans. So let me turn to you first for that, and then Jason, ask you to talk a little bit about how the program's working or not from its intentions. Go ahead, Brett.
Great. So as was referenced, you have seen the headlines about this program. Sometimes I get concerned with reporting that focuses on singular examples because it might look more like clickbait than the average or typical story. In this case, I'm less concerned because there really does seem to be something going on here with early evidence suggesting that the SBA data on PPP loans doesn't align well with the sectors that were hardest hit. So for example, if we look at the figure, accommodations and food industry received just 9% of funds, but at least at the period that aligned with this first deployment, nearly 2/3 of job losses. And conversely, if you look at professional, scientific, technical services, they actually gained some jobs early on, and they got the second most PPP dollars. So we've got the plus up. We've moved from the sectors that were first hit to second hit. So we don't have the latest data from SBA on how this will play out, but we have real reasons to expect for some of the factors that Noel anticipated and articulated, that we won't have a distribution that is well targeted to need here. We saw SBA's computer systems crash yesterday. Everyone expects the money to be gone immediately this go round, even though it's a huge sum of money. And so really the lack of any targeting to need, which other countries like Canada and Denmark and the Netherlands had some criterion around revenue loss that act as some sort of filter. That wasn't done here. So really it's who's getting to the front of the queue, both by turning in applications, knowing about this, having a relationship with the lender, and the lender prioritizing them.
Great, thanks. So thanks, Alana, for displaying the screen. And we will make that chart available on the event website, on the Urban Institute website afterwards. So Jason, now back to you. Again, talked a little bit about the flow of the program and where you see some of the big challenges. And at this point, is there an opportunity, if at all, to make a difference here?
Sure. So, I think as Brett and Noel mentioned, the second round will be exhausted in the next few days, probably as quickly as the SBA website can function. There are enormous queues. The archetype for this program was the small restaurant that was shuttered by a shelter-in-place order. It's clear that the vast majority of loan recipients are not in that type of peril. For the restaurant, 2 months of payroll will not be nearly enough for them to reopen. For others, 2 months of free expenses is an awfully generous subsidy. To put a couple of numbers around this, building on what Brett said, about half of the initial funding, $150 billion, went to companies with loans that were $1 million or greater. But to qualify for a loan of that amount, a company would typically need to have at least 100 employees, and most have much more. There are only 100,000 businesses of that size in the whole country, out of 6 million small businesses. So it seems that about less than 2% of the small businesses in this country received about half the funding. You saw this morning the Treasury Secretary say that every loan over $2 million would be audited. That's $100 billion so far for 25,000 loans. I think more effective would be for Treasury at this point to restrict the loan forgiveness based on a borrower's financial condition, as opposed to a focus on the size or industries. Senator Johnson, as it happens, has put forward one plan along these lines. It's clear that the qualification standard was inadequate. We don't rely on a company's moral judgment in nearly any other tax deduction or rebate program as to whether taking a loan is quote, the right thing to do.
So, okay, so I was talking with Brett yesterday, and we were trying hard not to be despairing about the fact that we will now have spent, I'm bad at the math at the moment, but well over $650 billion for a program that was perhaps very well intended to solve an immediate crisis, but history will look back and say perhaps didn't go to where need was greatest, is a gentle indictment of the efficacy of the program. And that's a huge expense at a time when we're facing lots of huge expenses in this economy. So I'm going to move us from despair to at least constructive engagement. So I'd love, and I want us to start to think a little bit about what should we be doing next. But one quick question before I get there. I noticed that there are a bunch of comments in the Q&A section about nonprofits and their experience in this program. And I just want to open it up to any of you. Brett, you're nodding your head, so it looks like you may have something to say. And Noel, if you want to add any quick thoughts before we get to solutions and next steps around how nonprofits could or could not have fared in the program.
No, I'll go ahead and start.
Yeah, so just from our network, what I've observed is that one, many nonprofits have been able to figure out a way to access it. Very quickly, we found nonprofits realizing that the large financial institutions where they might have had accounts maybe weren't working for them, but they already had other ways of getting to a credit union or a CDFI, the very small number that were actually engaged. So the access question for a nonprofit was oftentimes a little bit better than it was for a small business. The other thing is that the impact to our nonprofits is going to be a little different, right? So there's some that relied on earned revenue that took hits very early because they had affordable housing or small business loans or something. But what we're going to see from many nonprofits is actually in the third and fourth quarters of this year, the funding is going to dry up because it was all pushed into the COVID response. And so this may actually be creating a little bit of a buffer for the third and fourth quarter for many nonprofits that would be finding problems then. That being said, just like with small businesses, the smaller the nonprofit, the more that it's in a community of color, the less access they're getting is my anecdotal information. But of course, we don't have data from SBA on it.
Brett, do you want to just mention also your concern about the data from SBA that we are seeing and some choices they've made there?
Yeah, it's really mind-boggling to me. So under traditional SBA programs, we get to know things about the borrowers. And indeed, this is research that I've done on the SBA is showing how their portfolio looks in comparison with other lenders. And they have historically demonstrated higher rates of lending to women, to entrepreneurs of color, to startups, veterans, and the like. They elected not to include those attributes in required reporting for this program, which dwarfs their other programs in terms of outlays. And so we don't know, we may never fully know the ability of how these funds distributed. So we may be in a setting where, as we've been alluding to, we've had a real entrenchment of inequity via public federal spending, and we may not be able to fully document that. And the decision is entirely mysterious to me why we wouldn't want to know that information.
Okay, great. Well, listen, so I want us to turn to two topics. The first is what should public policy do? And then I'm noticing that there are a number of questions. If, as you guys predict, this program itself will be tapped out again, is it likely that we'll be adding more money into it in its current form or in some future form, or are there other policy remedies that should we be looking to? And are there other resources that you are seeing that might be available for borrowers, particularly the small minority-owned and particularly vulnerable small businesses that were once envisioned at the heart of this effort? So why don't I start with Jason, Brett, Noel? Policy and other options for small businesses.
Sure. It seems to me it's unlikely to be sustainable to do $300 billion of these loans every few weeks. And what's more, as structured, the program only provides for 2 months of payroll when more is clearly needed for many businesses. In the near term, I think my own preference would be that we create a tax rebate program that's more targeted toward income replacement, where we cover losses of companies that are affected by COVID while they keep employees on board. Senator Hawley's proposed something to this effect, as has Congresswoman Jayapal. In the aftermath of 2008, we had introduced two small business programs at Treasury that had proved effective. I had led the Small Business Lending Fund activity. We also had the State Small Business Credit Initiative. And these were programs that functioned over a longer duration at a more sustainable cost than PPP. But for the longer term, I'd mention as well, the CDC had a shelter-in-place plan for dealing with a pandemic. It's clear there wasn't any plan to handle the economic fallout that would entail. And I do think that it's worth considering a broader macroprudential approach to managing economic interruptions. Haphazard policies come with huge waste and abuse. They stir intense anger. And I think it's possible to define a safety net and a set of government responses in advance so that there is time to develop thoughtful policies. And while we've got lots to do in the near term, it would be worth investing a bit in that future as well.
Yeah, I just want to put a pin in that point. I think we had an earlier one of these about macro stabilizers, even just thinking about using triggers so that are economic indicators to know when something turns on and off, rather than to rely on when we can get policymakers into a room and have the right alignment to be able to reach some kind of bipartisan consensus. And those facts may have aligned to design program, albeit not ideally here, but they didn't, they may not continue to align. And in fact, the consequences are likely to be continuing. Noel, your thoughts both about this sort of recovery period and long-term resilience for policy, and also thoughts and good ideas for small businesses.
Yeah, so I think for me, for the organization that I run and a lot of the people that I work with, we just dumped $650 billion in grants. And lots of the people that we represent and serve didn't get those grants. And so to put it one way, I'll be damned if we stop the conversation about dumping grants on people just when we've gotten to the realization about who most of the economy is that we didn't dump grants on. And so I think it's very, very important for us to be thinking about low-cost debt and longer-term debt and all kinds of programs. I think the programs that Jason talked about are excellent examples of things that we should be thinking about. But the crisis is still going on, and there's still a lot of people who haven't seen a penny to sort of recover or deal with the immediate impacts, much less recover. And so I think that's where there is still going to be a very dramatic drumbeat that the bill has not been paid yet for lots of people, which is going to put a lot of onus on the CARES 2 or the next stimulus discussion, which may or may not happen. Frankly, it's going to be a very partisan and difficult thing. And unfortunately, oftentimes we turn to the concern about fiscal responsibility and boy, we're going to have to pay for this right when we start begin to talk about paying for things for poor people, for people of color, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think there is going to be a very robust pushback on the discussion about let's turn to recovery, or the discussion of, boy, this is a lot of money, maybe we should think about paying for it, before we have actually served everyone in this economy.
Brett, I'm going to turn to you, but one other observation I'll make is that sometimes the needs of small businesses and nonprofits are often better served, at least better understood and better served at the level of state and local government. Unfortunately, in this crisis, the impact of the crisis on their revenues means that at the very time that those programs might otherwise be a bit of a safety net for some of the small businesses, they are almost certain to be very vulnerable to cuts because the states don't have the ability to do borrowing in the way that the federal government does. So and maybe another discussion is a conversation about the way state and local governments can be supporting their small businesses, not taking anything away from your point that we shouldn't stop the conversation here. Brett, other thoughts about policy and what we need to be doing next?
All of this is tough. I mean, we have dumped an enormous amount of money, and yet even some of the firms that have gotten that help, it's not enough for some of them. You know, some of the firms didn't need the help to begin with, but for others, 8 weeks it is not going to be enough. And so I'm perplexed. I'm frustrated that we haven't thought about targeting until now, because we could have used our resources a lot better. I still think we're going to need to be in a world of demonstrating some measure of need, whether that's based on revenue or what have you, to use our resources in a way that meets that need. And I think fundamentally, there are tensions between helping firms and helping employees. And so we might think about how to separate those two a little bit more, and think about what we're wanting to prioritize in terms of firms as opposed to in terms of employees.
Many of the small businesses that we are talking about here are not, at least, I mean, small business as a sector is a sector where you have more churn in the firms than you have in other sectors generally, right? There are a lot of small businesses that don't make it, restaurants that you know in your neighborhood that open and then close again. There is a certain amount of that. Other firms are longstanding providers for their communities. But this is a vulnerable sector, and many of them are in industries that may or may not continue to survive past the changes in the way we work through this crisis. Do any of you have thoughts about what our larger policy goals should be? And particularly, Noel, I want to ask you to think a little bit about the changing demographics that we face and how important it is going to be to kind of get that step on the ladder for our communities of color. But any quick thoughts that any of you have about the sort of the future of the small business sector? We surprisingly have a minute or two left in our program.
Well, I'll just say real briefly that, I mean, that churn, right? I think a lot of people think about business failure as sort of a negative thing. And yes, I mean, you never want to have a business fail, I guess, but there's something very exciting about that. And it's something that makes our economy actually incredibly vibrant. And so it still puzzles me the extent to which small business policy at the federal level is as often sort of a cover for some other policy as it is actually directed at truly small business, truly entrepreneurial people. And so I think it's an area that perhaps this process wakes us up to the fact that there is an enormous amount of energy in our economy that comes out of that entrepreneurial churn, right? And that demographically, obviously, the future of our economy is increasingly in the hands and in the capacities of people who don't look like the country 50 years ago. And that's there's nothing wrong with that, right? That's not a political statement, as unfortunately sometimes it's taken to be. It's a simple demographic statement. And that sort of our macroeconomic ability to still be globally competitive, to still be out there as a world leader, an economic world leader, relies on us sort of closing these gaps in access to capital, in the ability to jump into that entrepreneurial space, among other gaps, right? So that, I think, has got to move to the center of our macroeconomic policy, and that today's microeconomic policy is tomorrow's macroeconomic reality.
Jason, I want to see, does anyone else have a comment on this demographic issue? And then I want to go back to a relatively technical question about the forgivable loans before we close.
Can I just give you a sobering statistic quickly? So Hispanics are 16% of adults, 6% of business owners, 1% of business receipts. African Americans, 12-13% of adults, 2% of business owners, and less than 1% of receipts. So we see more inequity in this space than we do, for example, in income. So the concerns and the disparities are very real.
So making it possible for small business to be a path to economic mobility for more communities of color is also sort of an essential part of the economic growth mix for the country as a whole going forward. Jason, anything on this? And then I have a quick question for you as well.
Most great things in life start small. Small businesses are a remarkable resource that's somewhat unique to our country, but it's also fragile. It wasn't until 2016, 2017 that we had rebuilt the same presence of small business that we had prior to the 2008 crisis. So yeah, I think the intention is properly placed to devote resources to maintaining this. The question is, can we do it a little bit more effectively and for a period of time that will allow small businesses to see their way through to a brighter future on the other side.
Well, I would love to end on that, but I do want to make sure I attend to one small question that I think maybe isn't very well understood. And if you would answer, Jason, there's a lot of uncertainty about exactly the way this forgivable loans work. In other words, they are this 1% interest rate, but the theory is that the government will come along behind and essentially guarantee the lender the amount. Can you explain that mechanism and whether all of these so-called fat cats, obviously they don't perceive it that way, but those who have taken advantage of the program that we've raised questions of here, Are all of them going to get their loans forgiven, or is some portion of this just been access to lower cost money, and will there be any return on the funds that has been made available?
Well, I think it's an excellent question that remains open and is probably more pronounced given the disclosures that have come out about the program. The way the mechanism works in practice is that a business receives 2.5 times their monthly payroll up front. After 2 months, they can go back to their bank, demonstrate that they've kept their employees on board, that they've paid some other expenses that are eligible expenses under the statute. And then the bank can go back to the government, and the government forgives that portion of the loan, which is in most cases going to be all of the loan or very, very close to all of the loan. In the event that the business does not spend the money on payroll or the other eligible expenses, but rather spends it on something else, then that portion is not forgiven, but what they have is a 1% loan that they have a 2-year term on. So 1% loan is very, very cheap, but it's not a forgiven loan. Forgiveness is much more valuable than 1% money. And so most companies are targeting the forgiveness. Now, the statute provides that the SBA is to issue guidance as to how the forgiveness will work technically, but that guidance hasn't come out yet. It would not be a surprise if the government looks to insert more strings as a result of what's come out. One thing to note is, Brett, to your point, it was there has not been a disclosure from the SBA as to individual businesses that have received these loans or the amounts that have been received, and it was a possibility that would never be released. Most of what's prompted the public outcry and the media disclosures is the fact that public companies determined that they were required to disclose these loans as material events pursuant to an 8K filing. And it's been those disclosures that have created a little bit of transparency and visibility into some of the consequences of the program policy.
So there is a conversation to be had about the implementation of the grants/loans that have already been made, possibility that some small amount of the funds might be recovered. That might also be a target for discussion about equity if there's dollars that have already been committed that are eventually returned to the Treasury. And a lot of further conversation about how we can support the population of small businesses, nonprofits, particularly those in underserved communities and with communities of color owners. All of those are really important topics for us to continue the conversation. Let me just say thank you to all of you who have joined us for this third in our series. There will be more coming on healthcare, on universities, on a bunch of other topics. Please send us your reactions and thoughts about them and ideas about what you'd like to see. My sincere thanks to Noel and Jason and Brett, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Be safe and well, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.